this video tanks, I'm just gonna give everyone another Batman thing next. I don't know, ranking all the costumes or something. Check out the timecodes in the description if you want to skip around, but first, a public service announcement. I actually started working on this video upwards of a year ago with the hopes that it would be done by the time Multiverse of Madness started marketing. At the time of this filming, it's now 2 months or less before that movie comes out, and I won't go into why it's taken this long, but I will beg you guys to make all of that time and effort worth it by giving this a like, sharing it around, and subbing to the channel if you haven't already. And yes, that means I had this script in the works long before the admittedly excellent video by Screen Crush, which beat me to a pretty similar premise. Fair warning, I'm going to be talking about applicability a lot in this video, which for those who don't know just means how the ideas that a piece of work talks about can be applied to everyday human life. See, I've developed this theory about the stories that I gravitate toward, to which I can in part thank tons of other better channels than this one, like Critical Hit or Just Right or Lindsay Ellis, all of which speak to story structure and whatnot. That theory is that, in particular, the stories I tend to dig are the ones that can be pretty much boiled down to a thematic argument between two extremes, where every relevant member of the cast exists on a spectrum, each character answering the central question of the story differently until one answer ultimately prevails at the end of the narrative. You could say that's nothing special, it's the vast majority of mainstream storytelling, but I really like the examples which ride the line between being explicit and keeping things in the subtext, while also just being really well engineered. The very few of you who are long-time viewers may have seen me take this approach a lot when it came to shows like DuckTales. Psst! Watch my DuckTales videos if you haven't already. In each of my reviews for that show, I tend to read through the lens of the cast arguing over central thematic questions. It's basically my go-to critical lens for any story that features an ensemble cast. In Astro Boyd, the central question is whether Boyd can be considered a person. Answer, yes. In Forbidden Fountain of the Foreverglade, the central question is what matters more, age or maturity. Answer, maturity. In Let's Get Dangerous, how critical should we be of our fantasies? Answer, just enough that they aren't harmful. God, I'm talking about narrative theory through DuckTales. The grim and gritty fanboys who are just here for the Batman stuff are definitely not going to be pleased with this one. The government pays me to teach your children, by the way. Not gonna lie, every time I've revisited this script in the past year, I've been hit with this worry that my videos start to feel samey, given how instinctually I read media through this lens that I'm talking about. But I figured it would be a good way to lay out, I guess what you could call my critical ethos, if I just flat out dedicated a discussion and analysis to how I process these things, using a movie I really like as a case study. Again, I don't want to pretend I'm breaking new ground or anything here, this is really basic stuff. But I think it's a neat thing for you to keep in mind as you watch my videos, so you have a sense of how I approach the stories that I like to talk about, especially if you're new to the channel. Yeah, it turns out this is also a surprise 5K sub special. Jeez, the original release of the 4K sub special was 3 years ago. You better not make this one flop too, YouTube, you sick little monster. Anyway, I want to use a movie from my favorite film franchise, one which I feel gets unfairly dismissed a lot of the time. That being Marvel Studios' Doctor Strange. And you know, I think this would be a good example to use because it's a rock-solid, straightforward, and easy-to-lay-out instance of what I'm talking about here. But also not totally flawless, so I can point out ways that I think a story can work this concept and also somewhat fumble with it. Shouts to C. Robert Cargill for giving this movie such an exemplary screenplay, by the way. Follow that dude on Twitter and listen to his podcast. He's great. It's also a movie I know so well and have thought about through this lens so often that I don't have to rewatch it in order to write this, thus saving myself 2-ish hours. I'm probably gonna rewatch it anyway. I did! More than once. Why am I like this? Whatever, anyway, moving on. The central thematic question that I'm going to tackle for Doctor Strange is this. How does one handle the passage of time? Meaning, how does one interact with it in a healthy, productive way? And over the course of this, we're going to watch as Stephen Strange starts believing one answer and then transitions over to another. Now, important note, this is not a comprehensive analysis of this movie. I don't mean to insinuate that this is the only thematic question at this movie's core. I don't think any story is strictly limited to one of those, and this film has loads of other ideas woven in and out of it. If I wanted to, I could, off the top of my head, say the central question of Doctor Strange is, how much does it matter if we play by the rules? But for the purposes of this video, the time thing is our focus. Doctor Strange is literally all about time, and brief sidebar, I want to talk about this cool thing that the MCU does sometimes, either purposefully or more likely by pure happenstance, where it bakes the central motif of the movie's story into the marketing. Captain Marvel and Spider-Man Far From Home are both movies that use the marketing to lie to the viewers in the exact same way that the protagonists of the film are being lied to, in stories all about how being lied to that way hurts. Black Panther's trailer used that Gil Scott-Heron sample about not being able to sit down and tune out and be passive to the needs of a revolution in a movie all about why the main character has to learn that same lesson. And Doctor Strange dedicated an entire trailer to the repetition of the word time, creating this oppressive sense of time hanging over the entire narrative, which is true in the movie itself. I find that worth noting in a Hollywood landscape where trailers often only serve to let you know that a thing exists and when it will be coming out. Also, kudos to Doctor Strange for being basically the only MCU movie that has an Infinity Stone in it and makes that stone into a thematic device as much as it is a plot device. Okay, sidebar done. There are two primary answers to what the characters can and should do, given the movie's central question. They can accept the passage of time, or they can reject it outright. In the time it's taken me to write this video, Marvel's released the animated series What If, and for those of you who've seen episode 4 of that show, you know that this is a theme which follows Strange's character beyond this movie. I'm not going to talk extensively about that episode for the sake of time, but I think it's an interesting supplement to a lot of what I'm going to be talking about here. Now, I'm going to pull a timey-wimey page out of this movie's own book and start at the end, meaning let's briefly chat about Dormammu, because Dormammu's singular scene in the film is both the most direct and most abstract expression of the movie's thesis. The lesson which Strange, the Ancient One, and the movie's audience all have to learn, among other things, that time is a concept which we must all surrender to. See, Dormammu is weird. For as much as I'm trying to use this movie as a straightforward example of stuff, this is the biggest way in which the story is, for lack of a better word, unwieldy. Because most other stories I could analyze through this lens don't tend to have an equivalent to Dormammu, this figure who's less of a character and more of an abstract force given form. I can't even call him a force of nature because at the core of our central question is the idea that time is nature. Dormammu is like a force of anti-nature. The one thing that makes him feel like a character and not solely a plot device with a voice is that he makes choices. Choices driven by emotional desires. Specifically one choice, specifically the choice to run away with his tail between his legs once Strange introduces the concept of time to his realm. And this is why I say this is both really abstract and really direct. On the story spectrum, Dormammu is so far in the direction of rejecting the passage of time that he's not even on the spectrum anymore. He can't even comprehend what time is, the concept is so foreign and antithetical to him. I imagine that's kinda hard for a lot of people to wrap their heads around, but it's also exactly the thing that keeps Dormammu the character useful to the movie's messaging. We can watch as all of the other terrestrial characters approach the passage of time from perspectives that are ultimately relatable to the human experience. Even the immortal magician lady is just a person, struggling with time in the abstract sense that we all do. Dormammu might be making an emotional, fear-driven choice, but he's also not coming at it from a standpoint that any cognizant human being can relate to, that being a complete unawareness of time as a concept. So really, what Dormammu allows us to do is take the film's thesis, the idea of surrendering to time, and to make it as literal as possible. Time isn't just an abstract because Strange is able to take it to a location, albeit a metaphysical one, where it wasn't before. Dormammu is a guy who has to, for the first time in his endless existence, comprehend what a moment is. And that idea, that notion in whatever equivalent he has for a brain, that time exists and that he has to operate under its constraints, terrifies him into complete inaction. The whole scene is like the TLDR version of the entire film. Look at this guy who has the power to gobble up whole worlds. Now watch him run away and fail to actually accomplish anything because he couldn't deal with time being a thing. For Dormammu and his followers to continue existing outside of time, they can't allow themselves to interact with anything. Can't be allowed to influence anything in any meaningful way because in a reality where time is present, their debilitating desire to get away from it means they may as well not exist. Like I said, it's unwieldy because it's really the one aspect of the film that, outside of the broad description, isn't really applicable to the life of the viewer at all. Time, for us, doesn't exist as a thing that can be looped, And even for those human beings who have trouble comprehending time as it passes, it is still passing, and we all have some awareness that the world moves forward around us even if we hate it. It's this messiness that makes the movie a more interesting case study, but also makes me want to get Dormammu out of the way first so that I can talk about the rest of the cast, and place them on the spectrum without having this big anvil hanging over my head with just how detached from reality one of its major players and definitive set pieces are. So like I said, that whole sequence is the movie dealing with time as an abstract, literalizing it to make a very broad point. The more applicable aspects of the story come from how Doctor Strange defines the concept of time through a couple different, less abstract ideas over the course of the film. And one of the most major ways it does that is through death. Kaecillius, as is usually the case for the villain in a film like this, lies on the far extreme end of the spectrum. And he is actually on the spectrum, unlike Dormammu, because he doesn't exist apart from time, he only wants to. And I just realized that saying all of these characters are on the spectrum makes it sound like I'm calling them neurodivergent. Maybe I should retitle this? My point is, the ideas expressed with Kaecillius' character can be tied directly to the real human experience. In what I consider a character beat important enough that it should have been shown rather than just told, tick one missed opportunity, Kaecillius lost his entire family at some point long before the events of the film. This is just like Steven having lost his hands in a car accident, and while Steven comes out of the accident wanting to reverse what happened to him, Kaecillius, interestingly, never speaks to wanting to reverse time so he can get his family back. For all we know, he may have had those desires at one point, but it's not something that he or anyone else really voices within the context of the film. Instead, he's got a much more literal vendetta against the idea of time as a fixture. His personal loss transforms into this belief that time, as the abstract reason for all death, is something that the human instinct longs to transcend. Kaecillius' dialogue with Steven in the second act of the movie is actually my favorite scene in the film, and it single-handedly elevates him for me above many other less defined and dismissible MCU villains. This same notion is also where the Ancient One factors in. It's really interesting to have a mentor figure not be on the complete opposite side of the spectrum from the villain in a movie like this. On paper, the Ancient One would be to this movie what Abraham Erskine or Ho Yinsen or Captain Marvel or Ben and May Parker are to their respective movies. The moral arbiter and the voice of the film's thesis. And while we do get a lot of moments where the Ancient One basically speaks for the screenwriter, particularly in her last scene, she spends the bulk of her screen time more philosophically aligned with Kaecillius than anyone realizes. Funny enough, writer Robert Cargill has mentioned that the Ancient One's death is the scene he's most proud of writing. And yeah, I can see why, because it's a brilliant exchange. Am I spinning around in my chair too much? I worry that I'm doing that too much and it's making you guys nauseous. But to the point, the Ancient One draws power from the Dark Dimension the same way that Kaecillius does, to keep herself alive. To ensure necessary futures, yes, but also out of a plain fear of death. Now, like I said, the Ancient One does have genuine wisdom to offer Strange, and that wisdom does push Strange further along the spectrum to where he needs to be. There's all that stuff early in the film about needing to surrender, and that ultimately ties into the more relevant lesson near the end, which is that Strange needs to abandon his ego because it's that ego that drives the notion in him, and in the Ancient One herself, that they can meaningfully circumvent time. Be that by trying to stave off death, or by trying to hold on to or run back towards a particular image of themselves. The Ancient One was basically a big cheating hypocrite who was so scared of time that she made herself immortal, existing, as Kaecillius longs to, as a being exempt and apart from time. And Strange, well, the conflict between Strange and death as time manifests a bit differently. One of the smartest things the movie does is insist upon Steven's title as a doctor as a thing that matters, not just to him personally, but to the narrative. The man is defined by his profession, and that profession is defined by the need to cheat death. His ability and drive to maintain life is both Strange's most endearing trait and the source of his massive ego. The Ancient One cuts to the core of Strange's dilemma when she speaks to his being driven by fear, and how it's that very fear that kept him from greatness. I think the Ancient One gets a pretty solid read on Strange's character when he says this line, one that's actually parroted later by Kaecillius.
We are made of matter and nothing more. Just another tiny, momentary speck within an indifferent universe.
Both of the men who speak this line are near paralyzed by their understanding of time as power. Strange is doggedly determined to get his hands back, refuses to become emotionally attached to his patients, and rejects patients whose plights he thinks will tarnish his record, because to do otherwise would mean accepting that there are things he cannot change. With this line about an indifferent universe, Strange is speaking to a deep existential terror in the nadir of his despair. That the measure of the universe's apathy lies in the fact that he can't preserve things in amber. It's a very ironic flaw because it makes Strange a creative, flexible, lateral thinker, all in service of ego-driven narrow-mindedness. His fear of time is his greatest weakness, but it gives way to his greatest strengths. Part of Strange's conflict is when he's expected to be okay with killing someone, and side note, I really like that we have a hero in the MCU besides Spider-Man who has any stated problem with killing people. Oh wait, does Daredevil count now that he's here? What about Luke Cage? Oh god, this is gonna be a whole rabbit hole. Look, I don't need every hero and every superhero thing to have a no-kill rule, but for too long in this genre there's been an absolute drought of superheroes on the big screen that are even a little critical of taking life at the drop of a hat. But that aside, it's incredibly important that Steven is transparently all about staving off death, is disgusted the one time he ends up causing death without meaning to, and solves the movie's final conflict without killing anyone. Doctor Strange, both the character and the film, accept death as necessary and accept the passage of time, but are super explicit in the belief that life for life's sake should be protected where possible. Steven is never punished for his desire to maintain life. He only has to square that impulse with the understanding that death and time are not his enemies. Otherwise, he'll end up like Kaecillius and get tons of people caught in the crossfire as he wages war on an unbeatable existential concept, seeing some lives as a necessary sacrifice to preserve the many indefinitely. Heck, Strange's distaste for killing is actually the one thing that stops him short of joining Kaecillius when he finds out the full scope of his plan. It's the one trait that keeps him on the path of heroism even in his weakest moment.
Dormammu made you a murderer. Just how good can his kingdom be? You think that's funny?
Strange's need to prevent the death of others is the one positive to come out of his rejection of time, even if it is an idea that needs to be refined by a wiser perspective, one that allows him to mature his relationship with death by acting in a way that's purely selfless. Strange can stave off the death of the rest of the world by facing off against Dormammu and his zealots, and he can do so by accepting endless time and death for himself. For eternity, if necessary. This is why I say that the Infinity Stone in this movie is a great thematic device. It had to pop up somewhere prior to Infinity War, and I'm not sure what process Marvel Studios or Kevin Feige or whoever used to determine which stones are in which films, but the Time Stone feels like something designed for the story of this movie, rather than a MacGuffin that just happens to be an Infinity Stone because we're gonna do Thanos later. The Time Stone allows Strange to literalize something that only a high-concept comic book movie could in terms of answering the central thematic question. Namely, it allows Strange to negotiate with the concept of time itself. You could say this hurts the film's applicability, and I'd argue it's just as much, if not more, a problem with the film as it is a strength, since in real life, the passage of time isn't remotely negotiable. But this movie is ultimately an idealistic power fantasy like most superhero narratives, and I think it's really smart how it presents time and our subservience to it as a tool. Conversely, I could say that Strange being able to cheat time the way he does is really good for his character arc, independent of the central thematic question, but that's a different discussion. I make a big deal out of time as death, but the movie is clever in not having death be the only meaningful manifestation of time in the story. Time can also equal the end of a relationship, the end of a career, the loss of an ability. Pretty much every major turning point that you could imagine in a life is indicative of time as an immutable force. And this is where Pangborn comes in. Pangborn being a brief look at a dark potential mirror for Strange that's a bit more applicable than Kaecillius or Dormammu. Pangborn isn't villainous, he's not even malicious or particularly powerful, but if Strange were to end up like him, that would be yet another bad end. Pangborn never learned the lesson that Strange eventually does about looking beyond himself and letting things end for the sake of the greater good. Pangborn lost the use of his legs, learned just enough magic to get them back, and then stopped. He's by no means a bad person, and he shouldn't necessarily be admonished for wanting the use of his legs back, but what he's done is ostensibly frozen himself in his own past. He had the same opportunity that Strange and the other sorcerers have to safeguard the world from magical threats. And while he's not obligated to have done so, had Strange gone down that same path, it would have indicated an active rejection of the best version of himself. On the thematic spectrum, Pangborn is right on top of Strange at the start of the film, set in his ways and eager to use magic to maintain his life as it was, rather than evolve in any way. By the end of the film, Strange has accepted the end of his old life, let time in all its harshness grow him, but he needed more than just the Ancient One's help to realize that growth. I mean, let's actually look at what we've crafted here so far. We've established that Kaecillius, our villain, is the end of the ideological spectrum, where our protagonist could have fallen if he fully embraced his initial flawed perspective, but also that our mentor figure is not the polar opposite of that ideology, not the figure waiting for our protagonist's fully realized best self to get up on their level. So if that figure isn't the Ancient One, then who is it? It's Christine. Let's talk about Christine, and for that matter, let's talk about the watch. So Strange has this watch on him that he seems super protective of, and it's super precious to him. It's the one thing he keeps after selling every other worldly possession he owns. He'd rather get into a fight with his busted up hands than give it to someone after he's being mugged, and at first it seems really arbitrary. And then we realize that it was a gift from Christine, engraved, "Time will tell how much I love you." So immediately this watch is tied to the question of time, and it's a really neat symbol because its meaning changes and shifts as Strange moves from one end of the spectrum to the other over the course of the movie. Early in the film, Strange is desperate to have his old life back, and yeah, that includes his career and the use of his hands, but it also includes his relationship with Christine. That's the part of his past that he's yearning to get back even before his horrible accident. It's the very first thing that we know for a fact he wants. He and Christine had a very one-sided relationship that Christine called off because she recognized that it was ultimately rooted in Strange's ego. Strange, who at that point doesn't realize that anything was wrong and just wants to snap things back to the way they were. The watch, as a symbol, initially represents the pull of Strange's old life. It's his main motivation for the first half of the movie. It's no wonder that after he looks at that watch and the audience sees the engraving for the first time, he rushes off to find the Book of Cagliostro and starts doing spells to make time go backward. Whether he knew what he was getting into with that book or not, Strange is spurred, invigorated by the need to learn enough magic so that he can go back to what he had. And right before all that happens, we see Strange, for what's obviously not the first time, trying and failing to ostensibly write some kind of goodbye message to Christine. He can't finish because he can't bring himself to let go of that relationship yet, that tie to his past, to the man he was. Like the Screen Crush video pointed out, we see the watch symbolism seated really early in the film, when Strange asks Dr. Nick West to cover his watch while performing a surgery. It's such an innocuous little bit, pointless to the scene really, besides establishing a watch as something that distracts Strange, something that pulls his attention away from the good he could do, just as his need to regain his old life distracts him from the good that he could do as a sorcerer. Later in the movie, the watch gets broken, and it's actually something that we focus on in the very final moments of the film, after Strange has moved along the spectrum and can finally accept that time has passed and things have changed and he can't go back. So suddenly, the watch, along with Strange's injured hands, have transformed into this thing indicative of Strange's new perspective and his acceptance of immutable time. And let me just say, I love the dramatic irony that it's only after the watch breaks that it becomes reflective of a character who's willing to let time go forward. Strange keeps the watch on him still, he doesn't get rid of it, and you can take that as him giving himself a constant reminder of his relationship with time, and of the fact that what he had in the past can't really be fixed. Not everything can be reversed. And then, of course, there's the actual relationship with Christine beyond the symbolism, because while the symbol of the watch pulls Strange backward along the spectrum, it's the actual voice of Christine as a character that tries to pull him forward. Christine is stopped from being just an object meant to further Strange's development, though she is also very much that, and becomes a fully realized point on the thematic spectrum in her own right, because she gets to voice the answers to the central questions that Strange eventually needs to come around to. Much like Nakia in Black Panther, she's the one character who basically has all of the philosophical stuff figured out before the movie even begins. And everyone in the story would do well to take some pages out of her book. A case in point,
Some things just can't be fixed. This isn't the end. There are other things that can give your life meaning.
Part of what I love about Christine is that, well, she's not really this movie's love interest. We open this film with her and Steven's romantic relationship already being kaputski, and while Strange and the audience have this expectation that they'll get back together eventually, they don't. And it really doesn't feel like Christine herself was ever entertaining that outcome. When they say goodbye prior to the movie's climax, I get the distinct impression that they could never see each other again, and both of them have made some amount of peace with that. Even with the growing that Strange has already done, their relationship, both romantic and professional, was in its death throes before the audience ever met them. And while there's not necessarily any bad blood, and by now we know that Christine is along for the ride in Multiverse of Madness, in the context of the first film's story, their lives have just gone onto different paths. It feels like the most mature and adult I've seen this kind of relationship handled in a Marvel film. Because where almost any other narrative would either have the characters get back together, or tease that possibility as long as they can, in one movie, Doctor Strange says these are two people who used to have something, who grew apart, and there's nothing wrong with accepting that as the way of things. There's nothing wrong with the fact that sometimes adults diverge away from each other and their relationship is just over. It's the most real, emotionally applicable manifestation of the movie's theme that we have, and I really respect how understated it is. Now, Mordo. Mordo's a tougher nut to crack than the others for reasons I can't really articulate, because his character seems like his trajectory was stunted or at least somewhat dictated by the need to end on a sequel tease. More than any other magician in the film, Mordo readily accepts the passage of time, and he ends the film firm in the belief that even slightly manipulating it is wrong. He's opposed to Strange in that lack of flexibility, and also in the sense that he's ready, almost eager to kill people. Mordo's a bit of a paradox, because he believes in the principle of moving on and accepting time as nature, but his beliefs are so staunch that in practice, he can't go with the flow and truly accept new paths in his life the way that Steven eventually can. He and Steven spend so much of the movie partnered up, I think, to emphasize this diametrically opposed sameness that they have. Mordo actually shares the same intrinsic character flaw as Kaecillius, even if they're on opposite sides, and manifest this flaw with opposite beliefs. They can't move on, can't move forward. Mordo starts the film further along the spectrum than Strange is, but actually moves backwards along it in its final moments, being positioned as a new antagonistic figure because his beliefs drive him to remove sorcery as an avenue for others to move forward with their lives. You know, the more I talk about it, the more I kind of bring myself around on it. It's a very interesting sort of dark reverse character arc. I've spent upwards of a year writing and rewriting this script, and I gotta tell you, concluding these things is always what really stumps me. I kind of appreciate this method of approaching stories even more now than I did when I started writing this. I think that's because doing it makes movies so much more interesting to talk about. Marvel movies are the internet's go-to shorthand for simple, dismissible fluff, and Doctor Strange is hardly among the most widely praised of them. But just look at what we have here. Make one spectrum out of the cast relationship to one central motif, and you find a story with worthwhile things to say. Characters and ideas in messy, complicated, layered conversation with each other. And I honestly think you could apply this same method to almost any story you can think of. And you know, personally, I'm tempted to do just that with other pieces of media on this channel, assuming that's something that people would respond to. If you're at all interested in the prospect of future videos being structured kinda like this one, then let me know in the comments. Better yet, what are some movies or shows or whatever that you've thought of through a similar critical lens to this one? Is this approach to analyzing characters and stories even something that you've thought of, and if not, is it something that you'd like to try after watching this video? Let me know, because I'm genuinely curious. Okay, so most of you have for sure clicked off by now, but I just wanted to say thank you for all of those who stuck it out this far. I was not remotely expecting to have had a bunch of new subs between writing this and posting it. Even a week later, having reached 5K doesn't quite feel real. And I'm just going to have to hope and pray that after this project there's not like a precipitous drop in engagement once I start doing more niche, smaller things that I'm still fully committed to. Doctor Who episode rankings or cartoon recommendations or whatever. I mean, there's worse things for me, of all people, to get pigeonholed into talking about than superhero movies, but this is probably more of a discussion for some kind of update video, I don't know. If you like this one, leave a like, maybe subscribe if you're into my whole vibe. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the future.